In the past 4 decades, China has undergone a genuine economic miracle. 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty through economic growth that has often averaged close to 10% a year. China's economic rise has changed the world. China went from nowhere to be the second largest economy in the world. But the miraculous Chinese growth is stuttering as a multitude of factors threaten the future. In 2021, COVID caused a plummet in consumer confidence. But unlike the rest of the world, Chinese consumer confidence has remained at rock bottom levels. The younger generation increasingly fear for their future. They say it is too expensive to have children. And as a result, birth rates have collapsed, with China facing one of the fastest declines in population. Recently, they were overtaken by India. In 2020, there were 5 workers for every 1 retiree. But by 2050, this will change to 1.6 worker per every retiree. It threatens to damage government finances and also end China's comparative advantage as an economy based on cheap, abundant labour. But just over a decade ago, there was tremendous optimism in China as it underwent an extraordinary investment boom, which was the main driving force behind China's economic growth. In fact, consumer spending as a share of income is unusually low, just 35% compared to 65% in the United States. In fact, a good question to ask is why doesn't Beijing do more to boost Chinese consumer spending and help rebalance the economy? The former era of cheap credit and unrestricted lending led to an unprecedented property boom. Although it's hard to compare, China's property prices as a share of income are amongst the highest in the world. One reason for this is that with excess saving and less choice of investment than in the West, Chinese middle classes often pushed their savings into property. In fact, the property bubble was so hot that people would take out a mortgage before their house had been even built. Property developers became highly leveraged, selling apartments on promises to build in the future. Belatedly, the government realised there was a giant Ponzi-style scheme. People had been priced out of buying a house, and the property sector was unbalanced. The government introduced these 3 red lines for the sector, but these policies to limit the bubble caused the current crisis. Like a brick pulled from under a stack, developers like Evergrande lost billions and became illiquid. And it's not just Evergrande sitting on giant losses. An estimated 20 million housing projects remain unfinished. And it's led to a new class of Chinese householder paying mortgages on apartments they can't even live in. Chinese household debt as a share of income has risen to 142%, and the take-up of mortgages has declined. Unsurprisingly, house prices have started to fall, and the decline has speeded up in recent months. In fact, the official statistics only tell part of the picture. The government are trying to prevent the worst of the housing crisis escalating, but they're caught between trying to deal with problems of debt amongst property developers and avoiding a worse crisis for homeowners. And it's not just homeowners who are affected. Local councils had relied heavily on selling land to property developers to fund their local services. But now land sales have declined. They are really struggling to raise finance. In fact, at this point, we may ask, why doesn't the Chinese central government do more to prop up the property sector, economy and householders? Because at first glance, it appears Chinese central government debt is very low by international standards. But this is misleading if we include local government debt, local government financing and the policy bank. The government has imminent liabilities of closer to 142% of GDP. In recent years, taxes as a share of GDP has been falling and budget deficits are rising. The problem is that China's tax system is focused on producers and local land sales. In effect, its whole tax system is based on an investment model which is in crisis. The housing crisis has spooked the middle classes, but there are further problems, because despite rapid growth, China has actually quite high levels of inequality and a very limited welfare state and healthcare system. China has one of the highest ratios of households burdened by health costs. As a result of this, Chinese households feel the need to save for health emergencies. And on top of this, of course, we have an ageing population and limited pension system, which is a further incentive to save. No wonder China has such a low share of consumer spending in their economy. Now, in the short term, the quickest way for the Chinese government to boost the economic growth they desperately need to avoid social unrest is to fall back on the export sector, which has done so much in recent decades. The government have offered large subsidies to exporting firms, and this has done much to boost recent growth. And by the way, when people talk about a collapse of a Chinese economy, this is kind of absurd because although China does have very real problems, you can't ignore the fact that it also has very real strengths, especially in manufacturing. China is a world leader in electric batteries. New electric vehicles are rolling off the assembly lines at a cost of $13,000, much lower than European and American car producers. The economy is not going to collapse when you're the world's biggest producer of solar power, wind turbines and steel. But this reliance on exports comes with its own problems. In the past few years, the international mood has darkened. There's a backlash against unfair subsidies and a perceived dependence on China for manufacturing. The Ukraine war, COVID, and the growing trade frictions all raise questions about the future of an export-led economy. It's not just Trump. President Biden has been jumping on the Chinese tariff bandwagon. He kept most of Trump's tariffs and added additional hikes of another $18 billion. But if Trump were to win the next American election, this would be dwarfed by an estimated $500 billion of new Chinese tariffs. And this would be really significant for the Chinese economy. Exports account for around 20% of Chinese GDP, but indirectly have a huge impact on the whole economy. A trade war is not in China's interests, but if anything, it could get worse in the coming years. I think the only comfort for China is that it is making progress exporting to new markets, developing countries and other BRIC economies. Recently, President Xi Jinping has become worried about the decline in high-tech startups. But in a way, entrepreneurs were scared off by state regulation, which saw a 2-year regulatory crackdown on the IT sector. IT was once a wild west within the communist state, but now code writers will need to make sure they promote content that the government likes. For many years, Western firms wanted to invest in China, but now foreign capital is drying up. The share of foreign capital has fallen from 60 to 20% in just a few years. And it's not just about the political climate. China is no longer the place of rapid growth that it once was. In 2023, Samsung saw a 20% fall in sales. Apple saw a 25% fall in the early part of 2024. And this brings us back to the major problem of low consumer spending in China. COVID and the strict lockdowns were a disaster, but the problems are much more deep-seated than that. Housing costs eat up a high share of income. Youth unemployment rose so much they stopped producing it as a statistic. Furthermore, the excess supply and weak demand is causing the Chinese economy to get perilously close to deflation. And this raises an interesting parallel. In the 1980s, Japan was predicted to be the world's largest economy. It would be unstoppable and overtake the US. But in the late 1980s, the Japanese property bubble popped, and it ushered in an era of falling house prices, falling property prices and a decade of deflation and low economic growth. Now, like Japan, China also has terrible demographics. An ageing population exacerbates the effect of deflation and low growth. Firms won't want to invest when the population is ageing. The Chinese economy will not collapse, but if we need a model of how the next few decades may pan out, Japan's era of stagnation is an interesting starting point. Last year in China there were only 6.8 million marriages, the lowest since records began in 1986, and nearly half what it was 10 years ago. And despite the end of a one-child family policy, birth rates have remained stubbornly low. Not only that, but China's one-child family rule caused the number of men to outnumber that of women. There are 35 million more men than women in China, including 17 million of marriageable age. But the birth rate crisis is much more than a mismatch of men and women. High housing costs, bleak prospects, and cultural shifts have all caused a birth rate of just 1.16, one of the lowest in the world. By 2080, the share of people in China over 60 will increase from 18% to nearly 50%. And this massive drop in the share of working people will not just create a massive fiscal burden, but also directly affect China's economic model, which is based on cheap, abundant labour. If China struggles to get enough workers, wages will rise and it will lose competitiveness to rivals like India. It's really a headache with no easy solution. But China is not unique in having an ageing population. But is it as dire as we think? This video looks at the problems of an ageing population and what, if anything, can be done about it.